Marcus Thompson never imagined that his budget vacation to London would change his life forever. The 28-year-old accountant from Ohio had saved for 2 years to afford this trip, carefully planning every penny to stretch his modest budget. He booked the cheapest hostel he could find, packed sandwiches for lunch, and planned to see all the famous landmarks without spending extra money on guided tours. On his third day in London, Marcus found himself standing outside Buckingham Palace with hundreds of other tourists. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as people gathered behind the metal barriers, cameras ready for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus squeezed between a family from Japan and an elderly couple from Germany, trying to get a better view of the palace gates. The red uniformed guards stood perfectly still like statues, their tall black hats making them look even more imposing. Marcus had seen pictures of these guards countless times, but seeing them in person felt surreal. Their faces showed no emotion. Their eyes stared straight ahead, and they seemed completely unaware of the crowd of tourists snapping photos just feet away. A middle-aged man next to Marcus chuckled and nudged his wife. "Look at them pretending to be so serious," he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "I bet they're just regular guys playing dress-up for the tourists, probably thinking about what they'll have for lunch or what's on TV tonight." Marcus smiled politely but felt uncomfortable with the man's dismissive tone. Something about the guard's perfect posture and unwavering focus suggested there was more to their role than just entertainment for visitors. The ceremony began with the sound of military drums echoing across the courtyard. The precision of their movements was mesmerizing. Every step was perfectly timed, every turn executed with mathematical precision. As the ceremony concluded, most tourists began to disperse, heading toward other attractions or nearby cafes. Marcus lingered, still fascinated by the guards who had resumed their motionless positions. He noticed one guard who looked particularly young, probably close to his own age. The guard's jaw was set with determination, his grip on his rifle steady and sure. An elderly woman approached the barrier near Marcus, moving slowly with the help of a walking cane. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small handbag. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her eyes held a mixture of pride and sadness as she gazed at the guards. Unlike the other tourists who were busy taking selfies, she stood quietly, her hands folded over her cane. Marcus noticed tears gathering in the woman's eyes as she watched the guards. Her emotional response seemed so different from the casual attitudes of other tourists that he felt compelled to speak with her. He moved closer and gently asked if she was all right, concerned that she might need assistance or was feeling unwell in the London heat. The woman turned toward Marcus with a gentle smile that transformed her entire face. "Oh, I'm quite all right, dear," she said in a refined British accent. "I was just remembering someone very special to me. These guards, they're not just performing for tourists, you know. Each one of them carries the weight of centuries of tradition and honor." Marcus was intrigued by her words. There was something in her tone that suggested personal knowledge rather than general tourist information. He introduced himself and learned that her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She had lived in London her entire life and remembered watching similar ceremonies as a child during World War II, when the stakes were much higher and the guards' duties extended far beyond ceremonial responsibilities. Eleanor began sharing stories about the guards during wartime, how they protected the royal family during bombing raids and maintained their posts even when air raid sirens wailed overhead. She spoke with such specific detail and emotion that Marcus realized she wasn't just recounting history she had read in books. These were personal memories, stories passed down through her family, experiences that had shaped her understanding of what these uniforms and traditions truly represented. As they talked, Marcus felt his perspective beginning to shift. What he had initially seen as an elaborate tourist show was actually a living connection to centuries of service, sacrifice, and duty. Eleanor's stories painted a picture of young men who had stood in these same positions during some of Britain's darkest hours when their vigilance meant the difference between safety and catastrophe for the people they protected. Eleanor's eyes brightened as she continued sharing her memories with Marcus. She told him about her grandfather, William Whitfield, who had served as a member of the Coldstream Guards during the 1940s. William had been just 19 when he was selected for palace duty, barely older than Marcus was now. The responsibility of protecting the royal family during wartime had been enormous, especially during the London Blitz when German bombs fell on the city almost every night. She reached into her handbag and carefully pulled out a small weathered photograph. The black and white image showed a young man in a guard's uniform, standing proudly outside Buckingham Palace. His resemblance to the current guards was striking, but his eyes held a different kind of intensity. This was someone who had seen real danger, who understood that his ceremonial duties could become matters of life and death at any moment. Marcus studied the photograph carefully, noticing details he had missed when observing the modern guards. The uniform was nearly identical, but the expression on William's face was more serious, more weathered than the young guards he had just watched. Eleanor explained that during the war, the guards had to be ready for anything. They carried loaded weapons, not ceremonial ones, and their training included combat scenarios that went far beyond the precise movements of the changing ceremony. Eleanor told Marcus about the night in September 1940 when German bombers targeted Buckingham Palace directly. Her grandfather had been on duty that night, stationed at one of the side entrances. When the bombs began falling, his first instinct was to seek shelter, but his training and sense of duty kept him at his post. He watched as parts of the palace were damaged by explosions, debris falling around him, but he never abandoned his position. The story that affected Marcus most deeply was about a specific incident in October 1940. Eleanor's grandfather had noticed something unusual during his night watch. A man was lurking near the palace grounds, moving in ways that seemed suspicious. Instead of dismissing it as a lost tourist or harmless civilian, William had followed his instincts and investigated further. The man turned out to be a German spy who had been gathering intelligence about the royal family's movements and security procedures. William's quick thinking and adherence to his duties had potentially prevented a serious security breach. The spy was arrested quietly, and the incident was kept classified for decades. Eleanor only learned about it years later when her grandfather was dying and wanted to share the story with his family. He had never sought recognition for his actions, never bragged about his service, and never treated his role as anything less than a sacred responsibility. As Eleanor spoke, Marcus began to understand that the guards he had been watching weren't just performing a tourist attraction. They were part of an unbroken chain of service that stretched back centuries. Each generation of guards had faced different challenges, but all had shared the same commitment to duty, honor, and protection of the monarchy and what it represented to the British people. Eleanor mentioned that her grandfather had kept detailed journals during his service, documenting not just the major events but also the small daily challenges of maintaining discipline and focus during long, difficult shifts. Standing motionless for hours required enormous mental strength, especially when tourists would try to distract them or make them laugh. The guards developed techniques for maintaining concentration, ways of staying alert even during the most routine duties. Marcus asked Eleanor why her grandfather had chosen to serve as a guard rather than in other military roles. She explained that selection for the palace guard was considered a great honor. Only soldiers who demonstrated exceptional discipline, physical fitness, and mental toughness were chosen. The training was intensive, covering not just military skills but also protocol, history, and the deep traditions that gave meaning to their ceremonial duties. The conversation with Eleanor was opening Marcus's eyes to layers of history and meaning that he had never considered. What had seemed like a simple tourist attraction was actually a window into centuries of British history, military tradition, and personal sacrifice. He began to feel embarrassed about his earlier casual attitude toward the guards, and grateful that Eleanor had taken the time to share her family's story with him. Eleanor noticed Marcus's changed expression and smiled knowingly. She had seen this transformation many times before when she shared her grandfather's story with visitors. People often came to see the guards as entertainment, but learning about the real history and personal stories behind the uniforms changed their perspective completely. She felt it was important to keep her grandfather's memory alive by helping others understand the true significance of what they were witnessing. Eleanor surprised Marcus by inviting him to join her for tea at a small cafe near the palace. She said she had more stories to share and some items that belonged to her grandfather that might interest him. Marcus eagerly accepted, curious to learn more about the guard's life and the history he was only beginning to understand. The cafe was quiet and traditional, with small wooden tables and mismatched chairs that gave it a cozy neighborhood feel. Eleanor ordered tea and biscuits for both of them, then carefully opened her handbag again. Besides the photograph, she had brought several other mementos from her grandfather's service. There was a brass button from his uniform, tarnished with age but still bearing the royal crest, and a small notebook filled with his handwriting. Eleanor opened the notebook to a page dated December 1940 and began reading aloud in her gentle voice. Her grandfather had written about the challenges of staying warm during winter guard duties, describing how the guards would secretly exercise their toes inside their boots to prevent frostbite. He wrote about the weight of the rifle and how his shoulders ached after long shifts, but also about the pride he felt representing his country during such a difficult time. One entry particularly caught Marcus's attention. William had written about a young boy who visited the palace regularly with his grandmother. The boy was fascinated by the guards and would wave enthusiastically every time he saw them. Despite their strict rules about maintaining composure, William had developed a soft spot for the child and would sometimes give him the slightest nod of acknowledgement when no officers were watching. The boy's visits stopped suddenly in early 1941. William later learned that the child and his family had been killed during an air raid. The tragedy affected William deeply, and he wrote pages about how the loss reminded him why his duty mattered. He wasn't just protecting buildings or ceremonies. He was protecting a way of life, traditions that gave people hope and stability during the darkest times. Eleanor told Marcus that her grandfather never fully recovered from the war, even though he served with distinction and received several commendations. The constant stress of being responsible for royal security, combined with the trauma of living through the London Blitz, left him with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. However, mental health support for veterans was limited in those days, and William struggled with nightmares and anxiety for years after his service ended. Despite his personal struggles, William remained proud of his time as a guard. He kept his uniform carefully preserved and would sometimes put it on for special occasions or remembrance ceremonies. Eleanor remembered how her grandfather's posture would change when he wore the uniform. The stooped shoulders of an aging man would straighten, and she could see glimpses of the young soldier who had once stood guard at Buckingham Palace. Marcus was deeply moved by these personal details. He had never considered the psychological cost of such intense responsibility, especially during wartime. The guards he had watched that morning suddenly seemed less like performers and more like real people, carrying the weight of history and duty on their shoulders. Eleanor shared another story about her grandfather's post-war life. William had worked as a security guard at various London locations, but he always spoke fondly of his time at the palace. He told Eleanor that once you had been entrusted with protecting the royal family, every other security job felt less important. The sense of purpose and honor he had experienced as a palace guard was something he never found again in civilian life. The notebook contained detailed observations about palace life that fascinated Marcus. William had written about the different personalities among his fellow guards, the small acts of kindness from palace staff, and the routine maintenance tasks that kept the ceremonial aspects of their job running smoothly. There were entries about polishing brass buttons until they gleamed, practicing drill formations in courtyard spaces hidden from public view, and the intense physical training required to maintain the perfect posture expected of palace guards. Marcus learned that the guards' training included lessons in royal protocol and British history. They needed to understand the significance of their role beyond just following orders. William's notebook contained pages of notes about royal lineage, the history of the various guard regiments, and the meaning behind different ceremonial elements. This knowledge helped the guards appreciate why precision and tradition were so important to their duties. Eleanor mentioned that her grandfather had often said the hardest part of being a guard wasn't the physical demands or even the danger during wartime. The most difficult aspect was maintaining dignity and composure when tourists or visitors were disrespectful. He had to stand silently while people made jokes about his appearance, tried to distract him, or treated him like a tourist, attraction rather than a professional soldier performing important duties. As they finished their tea, Eleanor gave Marcus a small gift. It was a replica of the brass button from her grandfather's uniform, something she had made years ago to share with people who showed genuine interest in the Guard's history. She told Marcus that she hoped it would help him remember that behind every ceremonial tradition are real people with real stories, sacrifices, and dedication to something greater than themselves. The next morning, Marcus returned to Buckingham Palace with a completely different perspective. He arrived early, before the tourist crowds gathered, and positioned himself where he could observe the guards more carefully. The brass button Eleanor had given him was in his pocket, and he found himself touching it occasionally as he watched the motionless figures in their red uniforms. This time, Marcus noticed details he had completely missed during his first visit. He observed how the guards' eyes moved almost imperceptibly, constantly scanning their surroundings despite appearing to stare straight ahead. Their breathing was controlled and steady, even after standing for long periods. The precision of their movements when they did shift positions was remarkable, each motion deliberate and practiced. A young guard who looked to be in his early 20s caught Marcus's attention. There was something familiar about his focused expression that reminded Marcus of the photograph Eleanor had shown him. Marcus began to wonder about this guard's personal story. Did he have family members who had served before him? What had motivated him to choose this demanding role? How did he maintain such perfect composure while surrounded by crowds of curious tourists? As the morning progressed and tourist groups began to arrive, Marcus watched how different visitors reacted to the guards. Some approached with genuine respect and curiosity, taking photos quietly and maintaining appropriate distance. Others seemed to view the guards as entertainment, making loud jokes or attempting to get reactions. A few tourists even tried to touch the guards or pose inappropriately for photos, completely ignoring the serious nature of their duties. Marcus felt increasingly uncomfortable watching these disrespectful interactions. Having learned about the history and sacrifice behind the guard tradition, he found himself wanting to intervene when tourists behaved inappropriately. However, he noticed that the guards handled these situations with remarkable professionalism, never breaking character or showing frustration despite obvious provocation. An incident occurred that afternoon that would stay with Marcus forever. A group of teenagers began harassing one of the guards, making loud noises and waving objects near his face to try to make him flinch. The guard remained perfectly still, but Marcus could see the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was struggling to maintain composure. Other tourists began to gather, some laughing at the teenagers' behavior, others looking uncomfortable but not intervening. Marcus thought about Eleanor's grandfather and the stories of guards who had maintained their posts during bombing raids. Here was a young man demonstrating the same discipline and dedication, but instead of protecting against enemy attacks, he was enduring harassment from the very people he was sworn to serve and protect. The contrast between the historical importance of his role and the casual disrespect he was experiencing was heartbreaking. Unable to watch any longer, Marcus approached the teenagers and politely asked them to step back. He explained that the guards were professional soldiers performing important duties and deserved respect. The teenagers initially laughed at Marcus, calling him a tourist who didn't understand that the guards were just for show. However, Marcus persisted, sharing some of the stories Eleanor had told him about guards who had served during wartime. To Marcus's surprise, his intervention had an effect. Other tourists began to support his request for respectful behavior, and the teenagers eventually moved away. The guard, of course, gave no sign that he had noticed the interaction, but Marcus felt that he had done something important by standing up for the dignity of the guard's service. Later that day, Marcus encountered Eleanor again near the palace. She had returned to visit, as she often did, and was pleased to see him back as well. Marcus told her about the incident with the teenagers and how he had felt compelled to intervene. Eleanor's face lit up with approval, and she told Marcus that his response proved he truly understood the lesson her grandfather's story was meant to teach. Eleanor revealed that she regularly visited the palace not just to remember her grandfather, but also to educate visitors about the true meaning behind the guard ceremonies. She had noticed over the years that many tourists arrived with misconceptions about the guards being mere performers, but she believed that sharing personal stories could help people develop genuine respect for the tradition and the individuals who maintained it. She told Marcus about other encounters she had with visitors over the years. Some people were initially skeptical when she began sharing her grandfather's story, but almost everyone came away with a changed perspective once they understood the personal sacrifices and historical significance involved. Eleanor had made it her personal mission to preserve her grandfather's memory, while also helping others appreciate the continuing importance of the guard tradition. Marcus realized that his vacation was becoming much more meaningful than he had expected. Instead of simply checking famous landmarks off a tourist list, he was gaining deep insights into British history and culture through personal connections with people like Eleanor. The guards were no longer just subjects for photographs. They represented real people with stories, families, and traditions worth respecting and understanding. Eleanor suggested that Marcus visit the Guards Museum if he wanted to learn even more about the history and traditions of the Royal Guards. She explained that the museum contained artifacts, uniforms, and personal stories from guards throughout history, providing context that would help him better appreciate what he had witnessed at the palace. Marcus eagerly accepted her recommendation, knowing that his perspective on the guards would continue to evolve as he learned more about their heritage. The Guards Museum exceeded every expectation Marcus had developed. Located in Wellington Barracks, just a short walk from Buckingham Palace, the museum housed centuries of military history that brought Eleanor's stories to vivid life. Marcus spent hours examining uniforms, weapons, medals, and personal letters from guards who had served throughout British history. One display case contained items similar to those Eleanor had shown him, including brass buttons, personal diaries, and photographs from guards who had served during World War II. Marcus found himself searching for any mention of William Whitfield, Eleanor's grandfather, among the documented stories. While he didn't find specific references to William, he discovered many similar accounts of guards who had shown extraordinary courage and dedication during wartime service. The museum's collection included detailed information about the selection and training process for palace guards. Marcus learned that becoming a guard required months of intensive preparation, including physical conditioning, weapons training, drill practice, and education about royal protocol. The standards were extremely high, and many applicants were rejected before completing the program. Those who succeeded became part of an elite unit with responsibilities that extended far beyond the ceremonial duties most tourists witnessed. Marcus was particularly fascinated by exhibits about the guards' role during major historical events. He read about guards who had protected the royal family during both world wars, through political upheavals, and during various security threats over the decades. Each generation had faced different challenges, but all had maintained the same standards of discipline, loyalty, and professionalism that he had observed in the current guards. One section of the museum focused on the psychological aspects of guard duty. Marcus learned about the mental training required to maintain focus and composure during long shifts, especially when dealing with difficult weather conditions, hostile crowds, or emergency situations. The exhibits explained that guards developed meditation-like techniques for staying alert while appearing motionless, and that their training included strategies for handling various types of disruptions without breaking protocol. The museum also displayed letters from guards describing their experiences to family members. These personal accounts revealed the pride, challenges, and occasional loneliness of guard service. Many guards wrote about feeling honored to serve, but also acknowledged the personal sacrifices required, including long hours, strict discipline, and separation from family during training and active duty periods. Marcus spent considerable time studying displays about guard traditions and their meanings. He learned about the significance of different uniform elements, the history behind specific ceremonies, and the reasons why certain protocols had developed over centuries of service. Understanding these traditions helped Marcus appreciate why precision and consistency were so important to the guards' duties. As closing time approached, Marcus felt overwhelmed by everything he had learned. His simple tourist visit to see the changing of the guard had evolved into a deep exploration of British military history, personal sacrifice, and the meaning of duty and honor. He realized that his encounter with Eleanor had been the beginning of an education that would change how he viewed not just the British Royal Guards, but military service and tradition in general. Before leaving the museum, Marcus purchased a small book about guard history and a postcard featuring guards from different historical periods. He wanted to have tangible reminders of his experience that he could share with friends and family back home. More importantly, he felt a responsibility to pass on the stories and lessons he had learned, just as Eleanor had done for him. That evening, Marcus returned to his hostel and spent hours writing in his travel journal. Instead of the usual tourist descriptions of famous landmarks and good restaurants, he wrote detailed accounts of his conversations with Eleanor, his observations of the guards, and his reflections on the museum exhibits. He wanted to capture not just what he had seen, but how his understanding and perspective had changed throughout the experience. Marcus realized that his vacation was teaching him important lessons about assumptions, respect, and the value of looking beyond surface appearances. He had initially dismissed the guards as performers in a tourist show, but learning their real stories had revealed layers of meaning and significance that he never could have imagined. The experience was making him question other assumptions he might have about people and situations he encountered in his daily life. As he prepared for his final day in London, Marcus felt grateful for the unexpected direction his trip had taken. Instead of simply collecting tourist photos and souvenirs, he was returning home with genuine insights into British culture and history, along with a deeper appreciation for the individuals who dedicate their lives to maintaining important traditions. Marcus decided to spend his last morning at Buckingham Palace one more time. He wanted to observe the guards with all of his new knowledge and understanding, to see if he could detect additional details or meanings that had escaped his notice during previous visits. He also hoped to share his experience with other tourists, who might benefit from understanding the deeper significance of what they were witnessing. The brass button Eleanor had given him had become a treasured reminder of his London experience. Marcus knew that whenever he looked at it in the future, he would remember not just his vacation, but the importance of taking time to understand the stories and sacrifices behind the traditions and institutions that shape our world. On his final morning in London, Marcus arrived at Buckingham Palace before dawn. He wanted to witness the guards' early morning routines, the quiet preparation that happened before tourists arrived, and the ceremonial activities began. The streets were nearly empty, with only a few early commuters and delivery trucks moving through the area. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the palace gates and the surrounding area. As the sun began to rise, he watched palace staff arriving for work, security personnel conducting their rounds, and the gradual transformation of the space from a quiet government building to the tourist attraction that most visitors experienced. The guards were already at their posts, having begun their duties hours before the public ceremonies would start. Standing in the morning quiet, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his understanding had changed over the past few days. He thought about Eleanor's grandfather, William, standing in this same location during the dangerous nights of the London Blitz, when his duties carried life and death consequences. He imagined the young guard he had watched being harassed by teenagers, wondering about his personal motivations for choosing such demanding service. As tourist groups began to gather later in the morning, Marcus found himself in an unusual position. He was still a visitor to London, but his experience with Eleanor and his time at the Guards Museum had given him knowledge that most other tourists lacked. When he overheard visitors making dismissive comments about the guards, Marcus felt compelled to share some of the stories he had learned. A family from Australia was taking photographs near the palace gates when the father made a joke about the guards being toy soldiers for tourists. Marcus politely approached them and mentioned that he had recently learned about the wartime service of the guards and their continuing role in royal security. The family was initially skeptical, but as Marcus shared some of Eleanor's stories and information from the museum, their attitude began to change. The Australian family became genuinely interested in the guards' history, asking Marcus questions about their training, their duties beyond ceremonial functions, and the personal experiences of individual guards. Marcus realized that many tourists would welcome deeper information about what they were seeing, but they simply didn't know where to find it or whom to ask. His accidental education about guard traditions had given him the ability to help others, develop more meaningful connections with British history and culture. Throughout the morning, Marcus had several similar conversations with visitors from different countries. Each interaction reinforced his understanding that people generally responded positively when they learned about the personal stories and historical significance behind tourist attractions. The changing of the guard ceremony became much more impressive to visitors who understood the centuries of tradition, training, and sacrifice it represented. As the formal ceremony began, Marcus watched with educated eyes, noticing details and appreciating nuances that had been invisible to him. Just a few days earlier, the precision of the guards' movements reflected years of training and dedication. Their unwavering focus demonstrated the mental discipline required for their duties. The ritual itself connected present-day London to centuries of British history and royal tradition. After the ceremony concluded, Marcus was surprised to see Eleanor approaching through the crowd. She had returned for another visit and was delighted to see him still at the palace. Eleanor asked about his visit to the Guards Museum and listened with obvious pleasure as Marcus described his experiences and the new understanding he had gained. Eleanor told Marcus that encounters like theirs happened more often than he might expect. She regularly met tourists who were initially casual about the guards but became deeply interested once they learned about the personal stories and historical context. She had kept in touch with several visitors over the years, receiving letters and emails from people who had been inspired to learn more about military history or British culture after their conversations with her. Marcus asked Eleanor if she had ever considered writing down her grandfather's stories or working with the Guards Museum to preserve his experiences. Eleanor smiled and revealed that she had been working on exactly such a project for several years. Her grandfather's journals and personal items would eventually become part of the museum's collection, ensuring that his story would continue to educate and inspire future visitors. As they prepared to part ways, Eleanor gave Marcus her contact information and encouraged him to stay in touch. She said that meeting visitors like him reminded her why preserving her grandfather's memory was so important. Marcus promised to write to her about how his experience in London had influenced his perspective on travel, history, and the importance of understanding the stories behind the places and traditions we encounter. Flying home to Ohio later that day, Marcus carried with him much more than tourist souvenirs and photographs. His brief encounter with Eleanor had transformed a simple vacation activity into a profound lesson about respect, curiosity, and the value of looking beyond surface appearances. The brass button in his pocket had become a symbol of the unexpected connections and learning opportunities that could emerge from seemingly ordinary travel experiences. Marcus knew that his friends and family would be surprised by his stories about the Royal Guards. Most people expected vacation tales about famous landmarks and good restaurants, not deep historical lessons about military tradition and personal sacrifice. However, Marcus felt confident that sharing Eleanor's stories and his own transformed perspective would help others appreciate the human experiences that give meaning to the places and traditions we encounter as travelers. The experience had taught Marcus that every tourist attraction, every ceremony, and every tradition had personal stories behind it. Real people had created, maintained, and sacrificed for these institutions over generations. Taking time to understand these stories could transform casual sightseeing into meaningful cultural education and personal growth. His encounter with the Royal Guard legacy had hit him like a revelation, changing forever how he would approach travel and cultural exploration.